the channel is growing, and new people are joining the chat stream, which is wonderful. And one of those new people has been very hot under the collar about calling people who question the state of the papacy. Basically, people, let me rephrase that because I've got to be clear. There are some people who question whether Pope Francis was validly elected, whether Benedict validly resigned, whether Pope Francis is validly the Pope. And this includes some of my best friends, by the way. Some of my best friends also are convinced he is the Pope. But that's not the point. The point is that there have been some people, I'm thinking of one in particular on the chat stream, who was accusing people who question the validity of the papacy of Francis as being schismatics, and has been throwing around that term and saying you're in schism, you're a schismatic, that's a mortal sin, blah, 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 if you question the circumstances of the election to the papacy of Francis. And that's really what I wanted to respond to, because that's not very nice. And it's not true. It is clear that doubting who the Pope is, doubting whether the person who is assumed to be the Pope actually is the Pope, if there is some grounds for doing so, if there are rumors that suggest that might be the case, then it is not schismatic to doubt that the person who people think is the Pope is the Pope. And it's even not schismatic to be convinced that the seat is vacant, or that the person who is being assumed to be the Pope is the Pope. It's not schism. Schism is something else. And the distinction between schism and Sedevacantism, that's just Latin for the seat is vacant, that there is no Pope, is a very clear distinction, and a very important distinction in these times, because we see the Catholic community being quite divided over whether Francis is the Pope or not. So what's really important is to accept the being a Catholic in good faith of people who have doubts. That's what's really important, is to not, exile them from civilized Catholic circles. And so that's where I'm going to go now. I'll just start with the heart of the matter. Now, this is a 8-volume work from the beginning of the 20th century. It's called Jus Canonicum. I think that means canonical law, if I'm not mistaken. And it is just a textbook on canon law. So yes, it is not in itself a church document, like it's not a catechism and it's not a encyclical. It is a scholarly 8-volume, very legitimate analysis or explanation of canon law. So, and the section is on the sense and scope of schism. The sense and the scope of schism. No, I'll just read the highlighted areas, I guess. The requirement for determining at law the crime of pure schism is, and then we have number 1, then we have number 2, and then we have number 3, that the withdrawal be done with respect to those things on which the unity of the Church is founded. Now, the unity of the Church is founded on the primacy of the Pope. It's founded on the real presence in the Eucharist. It's founded on apostolic succession, and so forth and so on. But it's not founded on the fact that Bishop Bergoglio became Pope. That is not a thing on which the unity of the Church is founded. That is a historical event. Anyway, that's number 1. Number 4, the 4th item here is more relevant. which is notwithstanding formal disobedience and denial of being subordinate. In other words, a Sedevacantist, somebody who thinks Bergoglio is not Pope, I know that's not the definition, but it's the sense in which I'm using it right now, is not denying that they are subordinate to the Pope. They're simply questioning that the aforementioned Roman pontiff is the true pastor of the universal church. In other words, in order for it to be schism, the schismatic must acknowledge that the aforementioned Roman pontiff is the true pastor of the universal church, and at that point must be disobedient to him and not be subordinate to him, after acknowledging that the questioned Roman pontiff is in fact the true pastor of the universal church. By definition, Sedevacantists today do not acknowledge that Pope Francis is the true pastor of the universal church. Therefore, they are not in schism. I mean, you can say you don't buy this explanation of canon law. That's okay. But you can't scoff at it as, a harebrained, not coming from just somebody who happens to have an opinion. It's coming from a pretty reputable source. Not that that source is necessarily sort of infallible, so to speak. But it basically means that those of you who do not believe that Bergoglio is the Pope, and may even believe that the seat is vacant, are not in a state of schism, and you're not guilty of the very serious crime of schism. So let me scroll down here in a way that you have a chance of reading what you want to read. Let's see if this does it. Yeah, there we go. Wherefore, I'll just go to the highlighted area. Finally, those cannot be regarded as schismatics who refuse to obey a Roman pontiff because they are suspicious of his person or because of unfavorable rumors spread abroad that he was doubtfully elected, as happened after the election of Urban VI. In the next part of the show, I'm going to talk about Urban VI and the Great Western Schism. Urban VI and the Western Schism. The Western Schism, or the Schism of 1368, lasted from 1378, lasted from 1378 to 1417, so almost 40 years, 39 years, in which there were at various times two bishops or three bishops claiming to be the Pope. It got started with the election of Urban VI. There were a lot of politics around the election of Urban VI. The story is that there was a fight between people who wanted a French Pope and people who wanted an Italian Pope. And the conclave took place in Rome, and they elected Urban VI, who was an Italian. And they, after Urban VI was elected, then cardinals started complaining that they were only elected Urban VI because they were afraid for their lives, what would happen to them in Rome if they elected a Frenchman. And so then you had Urban VI, who was elected by the conclave in Rome, but then you had cardinals who said we were forced to vote for him out of fear, so the election is invalid, and then they proceeded to elect another pope instead. And so you had these two popes, and then later there became three popes with another disagreement. Or he was pope from 1378, I guess, to 1389. This election of an Italian appeased the Romans, who were determined to end the the French-dominated papacy at Avignon. The papacy was in France at Avignon from 1309 to 1377. So this did not make the Italians happy. They wanted to end the French-dominated papacy, and they elected an Italian. But once he was Pope, he became very unpopular because of his behavior. A bunch of the cardinals declared his election was null because it was not made freely but under fear. So they elected the French Cardinal Robert of Geneva as Pope, and he became anti-Pope Clement VII. And that was the beginning of the Great Schism that then lasted. By the end of 1378, France favored Clement. And France was then followed by Scotland, Savoy, Portugal, Castile, Aragon, and Navarre. Now, England backed Urban, as did Bohemia, the Holy Roman Empire, Poland, Hungary, Flanders, and northern and central Italy. Eventually, Urban died, perhaps by poisoning, and they had a conclave to elect the Pope, and that was the end of the schism. So let me point this out, though. This is definitely relevant. The saints themselves were divided, okay? So who among us is willing to call half of these saints schismatics? St. Catherine of Siena, St. Catherine of Sweden, Peter of Aragon, Blessed Ursulina of Parma, Philippe d'Alençon, and Gerard de Groot were in the camp of Urban. St. Vincent Ferrar, Peter of Luxembourg, and St. Colette belonged to the party of Clement. Theologians were divided. There's no moral content to being wrong. It's not a sin to be wrong. It's not a sin to be wrong. You have these saints who were wrong, and because they were wrong, they were believing that the Pope wasn't the Pope. And yet they were not schismatics. They were not in a state of sin. They were simply wrong. And that, I will argue, is the case today. If somebody in good faith thinks for one or another reason Pope Francis is not the Pope, they're not sinning, they're not schismatic, they are simply perhaps wrong. If they simply don't know who to believe, don't understand, don't know whether the things that might have invalidated the conclave truly did, the things that might have invalidated the resignation of Benedict truly did, and so forth, then their only sin is being wrong, which is in fact not a sin. So now I will turn to the chat stream. What about speaking criticism? That is a very good question. That is a very, very good point. What about speaking criticism? I would say you have to be careful about who you talk to about this stuff, because although it's not a sin, although it's not a sin to be wrong, it may be a sin to weaken somebody's faith. It may be a sin to drive them away from the church. So you don't want to do that. So what I say and what I do, I don't talk about it truly unnecessarily. I don't talk about it with people who would be scandalized by it. I don't talk about it with people who would be driven away from the church if you talk about it. However, it's a very messy situation because the opposite is also true. In other words, there are people who would be driven out of the church, who are not driven out of the church if you talk about this stuff. And I'm not making that up. I have spoken to people who wanted to give up on the truth of the Catholic Church because they thought that Francis was teaching sin, was teaching against the deposit of faith, and therefore the church wasn't really the church. If you say to them, it's not a theological crisis if in fact Francis is an anti-pope, it's not a theological crisis at all, then perhaps they get relaxed and they say, oh, now I can breathe a deep sigh of relief and still be totally ensconced in the Catholic Church, because my issue isn't with the legitimacy of the church, It's with the legitimacy of the election of Francis. So, what is meant by the term anti-pope? The term anti-pope simply refers to somebody who thinks they're the pope and isn't the pope, or who claims to be the pope and isn't the pope. In other words, it doesn't necessarily require ill will to be an anti-pope. You could simply be mistaken and still be an anti-pope. I think that was the case with Clement, back in the Great Western Schism. He thought he was elected by the cardinals. He thought he was the pope. But I think nowadays he's considered an anti-pope. You certainly had Urban, who thought he was the pope, and Clement, who thought he was the pope. Neither of them were pretending to be the pope, knowing they weren't the pope. Both of them thought they had good grounds to be convinced they were the pope. But by definition, one of them was an anti-pope. Even if we don't know today which one was the anti-pope, by definition, one of them was an anti-pope. So anti-pope just means somebody who isn't the pope, who thinks himself to be the pope or is thought to be the pope. So anyway, so that's that. That's all I have for you today. I hope I haven't ruined your Sunday, but there's so much of this going around. That's a good point, Roderick. I mean, St. Paul said, why do you say you're a follower of him, you're a follower of him, you're a follower of Christ because you're baptized? We don't want to push that too far, right? Because then you get Protestantism. Is Clement and Urban the only examples? No. First of all, there was another anti-pope during the Great Schism. I can look that up. Let me look that up in a moment. See if I can see who. Okay, so you had. Okay, so you had Urban VI, you had Clement VII, and then you had John the 23rd. Yes, you also had a third. You had another church council, Council of Pisa in 1409, that declared that both Urban VI and Clement VII were anti-popes, and they elected a third purported pope, who would be anti-Pope John the 23rd. So anyway, that's not the only other anti-pope. I think you can Google. Should I do that? Should I just say, Google, let's see, anti-popes. Whoops. Let's see how many anti-popes there were. Okay. An anti-pope is a person who claims to be the Bishop of Rome and the leader of the Catholic Church, but is not the legitimately elected pope. Okay. So here we go. Hippolytus of Rome died in 235, is considered to be the earliest anti-pope. Then there was Natalius in the 3rd century, that's the same century, who, another 3rd century figure, Novatian, claimed the papacy in opposition to Pope Cornelius. Then you had the Western Schism, and I talked about those anti-popes. We have Natalius, we have Hippolytus, we have Novatian, we have Heraclius, we have Felix II, we have Ursinus, we have Eurylius, Laurentius, Discoursus, Theodore, Pascal I, Constantine II, Philip, John VIII, Anastasius III, Christopher, Boniface VII, John XVI, Gregory. There's quite a long list, as you see there. A very long list.
Sire